up to speed with the latest developments from the war in Ukraine. An oversight Russian airstrike that was an overnight on the southern Ukrainian region of Odesa caused significant damage to the port's infrastructure and destroyed some grain storage facilities. The Russian air attack on Odesa are part of a campaign that has made it harder for Ukraine, a major grain producer, to export its products via the Black Sea. Moscow quit a deal in mid-July that had enabled Black Sea shipments and helped combat global food crisis. The Odessa region governor says that the facilities hit contained almost 1,000 tons of grain. Ukraine's military said 2 supersonic missiles struck the grain storage facility. Separately, Moscow targeted the town of Berislav in the southern Kherson region. Russian forces abandoned Kherson city and the west bank of the Dnipro River in Kherson region late last year. However, they regularly shell different areas from positions on the east bank. Meanwhile, Ukrainian strikes inside Russia continue. Moscow's air defense units repelled several drone attacks over Belgorod and Kursk, destroying at least 11 drones. Also, Ukraine's special forces say that they killed Russia's top admiral in Crimea, along with 33 other officers in last week's missile attack. Although the big question now remains, did Ukraine kill Russia's Black Sea Fleet commander in last week's missile attack on Sevastopol, home to Russia's Black Sea Fleet? If Ukrainian claims are to be confirmed, Admiral Viktor Sokolov's killing would be one of Kyiv's most significant strikes on Crimea. This comes as Kyiv has said that destroying the Russian Black Sea Fleet would significantly speed up the end of the war. And finally, according to reports, Russia is seeking to rejoin the United Nations Human Rights Council in an election that will be seen as a key test of its international standing. Russian diplomats want to get their country re-elected to the council for a fresh 3-year term after they were expelled from the body last April after Russia started its invasion of Ukraine. All right, a lot to talk about. For more on this, we are being joined by retired Colonel Rich Oudston from Washington, D.C. He's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and the Jamestown Foundation. Rich, welcome back and great to see you. In your opinion, where do you see this war heading? The Ukrainians seem to be employing newer tactics, and not just on the front lines, but also increasingly deeper into enemy territory as the war progresses.
It's good to be with you, Susan. Thanks for having me. Well, as winter approaches, the pace of operations will likely slow, as it did somewhat last year. So there had been hopes in the West, or friends of Ukraine, that the counteroffensive that had been expected in spring and sort of unfolded late spring into early summer would achieve more decisive results than it has. And because the territorial gains or regains, taking land back that had been conquered by the Russians earlier in the war, has been relatively minor, I think there's been a slight shift in strategy. The strategy now is definitely one of cost imposition. And by that, I mean, if the Russians are going to dig these multiple lines of trenches and fight tenaciously to hold ground, then Ukraine will impose costs in terms of destroying the maximum number of personnel and equipment, and in the case of Sokolov, going for senior leaders as well. So the idea here is if they can't, in a one major quick thrust, throw the Russians out, they're going to make it so painful for the Russians to hold on to what they've taken so far that ultimately they'll be driven to negotiations.
Let's talk about all of these equipment, military equipment, notably, that the Ukrainians have been receiving. We have Abrams tanks, we have the newer missiles, more are coming from the United States. It seems the Ukrainian president is getting almost everything that he wished for. How do you see and how do you look at their usage on the battlefield?
Well, for those who are anxious to see the war come to a successful end for Ukraine, it's been a bit frustrating, to be honest with you. Some of the major supporters of Ukraine and the United States and Great Britain and Germany and others have been very vocal in providing political support and economic support, but very slow in providing the most capable weapons. With the United States, of course, these Abrams tanks that are arriving now could have conceivably arrived last year and prevented more of the gains that the Russians had. also what they call ATACMS missile, the Army Tactical Missile System, which has a range of 150, 160 kilometers. So you're not talking about hitting targets very close, but in the depth of the Russian position. The U.S. position has been, we're not going to provide those because really it's seen as potentially escalatory. And there's a subtle messaging game going on with Russia that the United States wants to keep the fighting to a certain level. So I think it's probably not quite right to say that Zelensky's gotten everything he wanted. He's gotten most of what he wanted, but a lot more slowly than he would have hoped for.
Yeah, and in some cases, first the United States says no, and then we provide them with those weapons ultimately. So, like you mentioned, the messaging hasn't been very clear. Maybe to Russia it has. Rich Outson, thank you so much for joining us from Washington, D.C., and I do look forward to speaking to you again very soon.
Thanks, Susan.